Please be seated. There's a new kind of wave going through Christian circles now where Easter is referred to as Resurrection Sunday. And either of them is appropriate. Think about it. Easter is traditionally what we call it. Resurrection Sunday is what happened and what we celebrate today. In Christian circles, much attention is given to the cross, and rightly so. But without the empty tomb, our faith is worthless. Without Jesus rising from the dead, our faith means nothing. Without the resurrection, all of Jesus' claims mean nothing. Jesus predicted his own resurrection. Jesus healed the sick. He preached the good news. He brought the kingdom of God to earth. If he did not rise from the dead, none of it means anything. Without the resurrection, Jesus becomes nothing more than a good teacher, a nice man who taught us to do good and to be nice to each other. But in the resurrection, we're confronted with a reality that's greater than our own. Who was this man who could give us life? Who is this man who could give life to anyone? In all of history, no one else has been able to do that. Buddha, Muhammad, Confucius, none of them were able to do that. And none of them claimed to be God as Jesus did. And his resurrection from the dead was proof of that claim. His resurrection from the dead says that I am who I said I am. Jesus, as we know, suffered horribly during his passion. Started in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was beaten, scourged to... He probably would have died just from the scourging, from the tremendous amount of loss of blood. And then he was crucified, left to die on a tree. Crucifixion itself is a relatively bloodless procedure, but it often takes days. Jesus was so weakened by the scourging that he died relatively quickly. On the cross, his heart was thrust through with a spear. Blood and water came out. Nowadays, we know that this is a medical condition, and I'm not a doctor, I don't know anything about this stuff, but it's a medical condition that doctors describe as proving that death has occurred. When the sac around the heart fills with water, it means that the person has died. And these Roman soldiers were experts at execution. They knew when someone was dead. You've heard the theories, well, Jesus really didn't die on the cross, and in the coolness of the tomb, he was revived and he walked around. No. If those Roman soldiers had failed in killing and executing someone, they'd be next. They knew when someone was dead. Execution back then was no different than it is today. Next, Jesus is prepared for burial. He's washed, he's wrapped in spices and linen, and placed in a rich man's tomb on Friday at dusk. All this was a fulfillment of prophecy, fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. And then all day Saturday, he lay in the tomb. But on Sunday morning, something spectacular happens. In Matthew 28, verses 2 through 6, we read, "There was a great earthquake, For an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. There's quite a picture right there, isn't there? His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. Picture this in your mind. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. Yeah? But the angel said to the women, notice he said to the women and not to the guards. He says to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he is risen as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. As Christians, the church in general, we seem to spend a lot of time on the pre-resurrection part of the cross. We seem to focus on who we were before we were transformed, before we became born again, on our sinfulness. And yes, we do sin. But as Paul says, our sin nature now is dead. And we are resurrected with Christ. I'm reminded of a sermon I heard years ago by a man named Tony Campolo, I think was his name. And he was describing a sermon that he heard by this African-American Pentecostal preacher. And he said he sat in this church, and the guy starts out preaching. You know, he says, it's Friday today, but Sunday's coming. It's Friday today, but Sunday's coming. And of course, Tony says, it's a very simple message. He says, but by the time that guy got done with this simple little message, he said the place was rocking. And I want to tell you right now that Sunday's here. You live in Sunday. You live in Resurrection Sunday. Friday is past. See, the real miracle of Easter is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And through our faith in Him, we too are resurrected with Him. We become new people, a new creation. The truth in all of this is that God became man. That alone should just boggle our minds. He lived a perfect, sinless life. That should boggle our minds too. I can't imagine that. I can't imagine going through a day without sinning. Going through 10 minutes without sinning. He went around Israel and the surrounding Gentile nations teaching, healing, and doing miracles to attest to the fact that He was God and the kingdom of God is now on earth. That kingdom that you and I, that every believing Christian is part of. And then He willingly allowed Himself to be tortured to death for us, for you and I. Then He rose from the dead. Only time this has ever happened. And He now sits at the right hand of God. And when we equate that truth to what Paul says, that you and I are seated with Christ in the heavenlies, we are with Him right now in a way that we can't explain. We have two realities. One here, one in heaven. And Paul tells us in Colossians 3:1 that since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in place of honor at God's right hand, and we with Him. In Matthew 20, I'm shifting gears just a little bit here, we read about Jesus leaving Jericho. This is the story of blind Bartimaeus. In Matthew's story, there are two blind men. The other two Gospels tell us only about one of them, but there were two. And they cry out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on us. Have mercy on us. And Jesus stops. And he says, bring them to me. And they come over, and Jesus, stopping, he says to them, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? And I want to ask you that same question. What do you want Jesus to do for you? Is it healing for yourself or a loved one? Is it financial? Relationship? Wisdom? Guidance? Provision? Peace? Salvation for a loved one? Or just plain more of Him? Think about that for just a moment, and then I want us to stop and pray quietly. What do you want Jesus for you to do for you today, right now, on Resurrection Sunday? Let's take a moment and pray. Remember, this is Resurrection Sunday, the greatest miracle that ever occurred. A Sunday of miracles, a day of miracles. The beginning of a new life for all of us. Now, Ginny, would you come forward? You're going to do your thing with the eggs now and the kids? Okay.